I want to make sure that we have covered the basic questions under the curriculum area as a way of getting into a discussion of teaching. I think number one, what is an ANISA definition of curriculum you have down? It's a statement of two interrelated sets of goals, one having to do with process, the other content, and what children do, usually with the help of teachers and peers, to accomplish those objectives. What children do is called the interaction component, and it was that interaction component that most people were confusing with process. You have to go through certain kinds of interactions repeatedly before you get the process internalized. Process referring to a pattern use of energy that we believe underlies learning competence in that area. So that pattern use of energy might be in the affect, it may be for having feelings, it may be for thinking, it may be for perceiving or intending to do things or whatever. Number two, what is the difference between content and process? This is a little more complicated than I would like it to be, but I don't know how to get it any more simple. But content we use to refer to information. Oh, Mag, not you, Mag. Mag provides so many kinds of supports for this operation. Psychological, physical, spiritual. It is useful, no, it's even necessary to get a clear idea of the difference between process and content, because when you come to plan an experience for a child, it helps you understand what it is you're doing. If you know what the content objectives are of the experience you're planning and the process objectives, they will be interrelated. So there's no way you can get them torn apart. But to have the difference in your head clear is useful because it will keep you from leaving important things out when you're planning. And as you will see when we come to our discussion on planning on Tuesday, that the reason most people's planning efforts are such a shambles is they don't have a framework within which to carry forward the planning. And if they would sit down and spend the first 3 days getting that framework set, of course it may take 6 weeks, but if you get the framework set, then the planning goes extremely quickly because everybody's on the same wavelength. Now you will be doing lots of little mini planning operations as you're working with given children, because you'll see that they have different needs and you want to provide an experience for them. And when you plan that experience, you can do it very quickly, almost in your head without writing anything down, if you know the right questions to ask yourself. And those questions should be initially related to what it is you're trying to accomplish, and secondly, how you go about arranging environments and guiding interaction with the children with those environments to accomplish those objectives. And if you break the objectives down into content and process, this provides, we think, the best framework for doing that planning, whether it's a big plan or whether it's a little tiny plan. Content for us refers to information about the world in which we live. And that information is usually symbolically coded in words. It's factual information. The sun is 93 million miles away from the Earth. There are 365 days in a year. There are 4 seasons, and these are the seasons and these are their characteristics. New York City is the biggest city in the United States, and so on and so on and so on. That would be content. Now, one of the qualities of a good curriculum, and therefore one of the qualities of a good teacher, because these are independent qualities here, if you got a good curriculum, it improves teaching. One of the qualities of a good curriculum is an absence of unnecessary, useless information. See, the amount of information that we have is endless. The question is, what is most important for the destiny of that child? And since there is so much of it, and you can't do it all, you must select. The question then becomes, what should you leave out? And what should you put in? We have some ideas about that. And what you should put in and what you should take out will, in many cases, be largely determined by the culture and the community in which you live. They'll have their own ideas about what ought to be left in and what ought to be taken out. But we would like the ANISA curriculum to be as universal as possible and to provide information about mankind as a species and his living on this planet and this planet's relationship to the galaxy. And that kind of informational base should be of high priority. We're going to talk a little bit later on about criteria for determining whether or not a certain body of information is really all that important. But because importance in Whitehead's terms refers to a gradation of relevance, some things will be more important than others. So when you get it all listed in arranged in priority, the content, you only have a certain amount of time. You take the best stuff off the top and you let all this go. This stuff up here will be far more interesting. It's likely to be more complex and more difficult to test for and examine. And so the natural tendency will be to use all this down here, which really won't be all that important. Now, just one little more footnote on that subject of relevant content and making some kind of priority assessment on the information you give your kids. Much of the determination and decision making about what is important is made by the textbook companies. And the only way you can get around it if you're using textbooks in a school is to just tell the kids to skip this chapter, skip that chapter. But the problem is all this stuff is more or less homogenously distributed throughout the whole text, so it's very hard to indicate to the child what's more important and what's less important. So you have to help if you're going to use a textbook, which I think you'll have to, particularly in the upper grade levels. You will have to convey to the child, just by virtue of the way you carry on your teaching generally, the kinds of things that are most important. From Whitehead's point of view, these will be the broad generalizations which have implication for action, or the broad generalizations that have implication for understanding things, which then have implications for action. There is a great regret, I think, that the commercial educational materials publishing companies are determining so much for us what we ought to be doing in the way of information in schools. And we need to find a way in the future of having the school systems and the teachers and the professionals in the education operation making decisions about what they want, and then let the textbook companies and the writers and so on produce what you need, rather than they're just coming with their catalog saying, this is what we have, what will you buy from it? So there's a lot of discussion that has to take place about information and content. This again has implications for testing, which we will have a chance to talk about a little bit later this afternoon. We're talking about the evaluation function of teaching. Yeah?
Will ANISA eventually do its own publishing?
Yes. We have a materials development unit in the big ANISA Center, which not only produces written materials, but produces films, videotapes, and other kinds of equipment. We have an engineering lab on the drawing boards, so that if a teacher is analyzing a child's difficulty in understanding something, they could come to the engineer and any other specialist that we might have, describe the child's problem, and the three will create a new kind of educational material or equipment designed for that child to try out. Supposing the child's having trouble making a certain kind of spatial differentiation, and you need some three-dimensional wooden blocks of some kind, in a certain way, painted in a certain way of a certain size. You simply come to the engineering lab and say, this is the kid's problem, and I think if we did this and this and this, we might get there. And through the consultation, the engineer spins out a design of the material. He takes it to the workers in the engineering lab, and in 48 hours, you have the new material ready to test out. And you give it a try. If it doesn't work, you send it back for revision until you get it the way you want to. And this is the way we discover what problems children have and how to go around doing it. That material then will be carefully assessed, the assessment will be written up, and it will be put on a file. And a duplicate copy of the material will be made for the archives of the materials lab. And then there will be an updated catalog of the available new materials that anybody can use. And when you have staff seminars, all the materials will be presented and explained, and everybody can then make use of it. It's going to be quite an operation when we get it going. So, may I assume you have a clear notion of what content is? Now let me tell you where it gets complicated. And I always hate to talk about this now because I run the risk of introducing confusion after I've just made an attempt to clarify things. But it gets far more complicated than that because there is information about process which can be symbolically coded. For instance, the word classification is a name given to a process. But knowing what classification is in symbolic terms is a part of content. Being able to do the classification is the process. So you have to have, as a part of the content associated with the process, the verbal explanation of what it is. Now, it is possible for a child to be able to explain verbally something about a process, but not be able to do it. For example, you could very well imagine a child giving you a description of what skiing is, and yet not being able to ski. Now, the verbal description of what skiing is and how they do it, verbally described, is content. That's information about a certain activity, a sports activity that's well known to everybody. And there will be thousands of people, millions of people, who have content information about skiing, but can't do the actual psychomotor process, which is the pattern of muscle movement, which we call skiing. Putting your feet on two wooden slats and coming down the mountain without using your balance, without losing your balance. That's the process. So the actual use of the energy to do something is process. The information about it is still content. Now, we have found ourselves that when we come to analyze a learning experience, when we force ourselves to make that distinction, it makes planning very much more comprehensive than what you're trying to do. Because when you think of content first and then process, being forced to deal with those two classifications of goals causes you to uncover many things that you will take for granted that you wouldn't have thought of before, which will be confusing to the child if you don't clarify. I was just telling Mag driving up, we passed some of the Suffield Gardens that the city has made available to people who want to have a little plot. And there was a scarecrow out there. And I said to Mag, you know, it was 20 years. I was 20 years old or so before I realized that a scarecrow was supposed to scare crows. And that's because I grew up in a part of the country where there aren't any crows. Now, if they had a scare sparrow, I might have gotten the message. But, see, nobody ever told me what a scarecrow was. I mean, I knew what it was in the sense that I've seen them in the fields, and I could identify one. But because it's all one word, and I even knew that it was to keep the birds off. But you see, I didn't make the connection between keeping birds off and scaring away the crows, which are two ways of saying the same thing, you see. Now, I am sure that children go through life having all kinds of words that they never see the roots of. I knew what a windmill was in the sense that winds turn something, but I didn't know that I didn't understand the mill part, because in Nebraska we use windmills not to mill anything but to pump water. So we should have called it a wind water pump or something, because ordinarily milling is not a word you use in connection with water. It's a word you use in connection with grinding grain. Is that right? Well, when you come to examine content and information, then, it means examining the words that are used. And we have found a tremendous degeneration in the use of English. I mean, I can see it. A tremendous degeneration in just the last 10 years. And on our way here, we passed a school in Northampton called the Hawley Grammar School, and I said to Mag, you know, in those days, they thought the language was very important. They even named the school Grammar, which in a sense focused on what they wanted kids to do, because grammar is syntax, and syntax is what stands between phonology, the sound of the language, and the semantics, the meaning. And therefore, to understand the structure of language is the single greatest open door to further growth and development. That's not a bad idea to have a grammar school, seen from that point of view. But now we have a tendency to say, oh, grammar is so dull. Don't bore these poor children with grammar. And so they grow up without any. Well, they have some. You can't help but have some. Otherwise you sound like a babbling idiot. But a lot of them do sound like babbling idiots, as it turns out. They do not understand the structure of the language, and therefore when they come to put their thoughts down in writing, they cannot do it clearly. Well, a footnote on process now, in contradistinction to content. This is a reiteration and is therefore redundant, but redundancy is an important form of emphasis. So I'm not going to apologize, but I just said that so that you don't expect an apology for hearing it again. Process refers to a patterned use of energy. in one of these 5 categories: psychomotor, perceptual, cognitive, affective, and volitional. And we are willing to presume that a patterned use of energy in one of those 5 ways will be accompanied by a structural change in the brain somewhere when learning takes place. Or if not a definite structural change, at least a functional change. In other words, you may not see any anatomical difference in the way the nerves are related, but you might find the pattern of firing of the neurons to be changed. As you know, these neurons store an electrical charge which they fire 15 to 20 times a second. 14.5 billion of them. That's a lot of activity going on. And you can imagine the infinite variety of patterns of firings that are possible. When we come to the memory seminar on Monday, we're going to be talking about anatomical, physiological correlates of memory, and that's thought to be one of them. There has to be something in there, though, that enables the organism to initiate a similar pattern of firing. And in any case, that pattern is going to be a patterned use of energy. And we will see it in observable terms as the person's feelings, as a pattern of thinking, a pattern of sensing things, perception, or whatever. I think it's clear then that the process part of a curriculum, as we are defining it, is what has been largely missing in any overt deliberate sense in the organization of the educational experience for children as they have it in traditional schools. Now, we've talked with a lot of teachers, and most of them will say, I believe it is important for a child to have his emotions organized. I think it is important for him to know how to think, and how to see, and how to listen, and so forth. But they have no very clear notion of what kind of an experience a child needs to have in order to be able to do those things. And that's what our 20 years of research is about, and that's what I think we've made our big gains in now as a beginning. Number 5, what are the basic categories of psychological potentiality you know about? There's 5 of them. But there is one area that I didn't talk about very much, which I want to fill in this morning. In fact, 2 of them I didn't talk about very much, the affective area and the volitional area. So I'd like to just take a few minutes and fill in some gaps there. The affective part of man's experience concerns his emotions. When a baby is born, he is capable of a general aroused state, emotional state, or a calm state, so that you have, the baby is born with just 2 basic states, you might say, calm and aroused. Now, as he gains experience, those begin to be differentiated and integrated, largely by virtue of the kinds of experiences the child has. Then he comes to communicate those inner states of feeling by his voice, not through speaking, but through crying or sounds of some kind. And when he coos and makes little babbling sounds, you know that he is having one kind of affective or emotional experience. When he screams and hollers, you know it's another kind. And the screaming and the hollering and the crying and the fussing, over time, begins to introduce new differentiations. And even within 3 weeks, a mother can begin to tell the difference between a child's crying when he is mad and angry and teed off, or when he is hurt, or when a pin is sticking him, or he's uncomfortable because the diaper is wet, or because he's hungry, or because he's got a tummy ache. One begins to sense these differences. And it's interesting that the child himself must be able to sense the differences because the quality of the voice gets changed. This is more or less built into the child. Now, by the time a child comes to school, many, many differentiations have taken place. Now, Mag and I have wrestled with this affective area ever since she's joined the staff. And I believe that Mag has read more books on emotions than any other living creature in the universe. And we have gone up and down and around and through and in and out until we're just an emotional wreck reading all this literature on emotion. And in fact, we even put, when we got our first $250,000 grant for ANISA, the whole team devoted its attention to affective development because we thought we'd pick something that was hard first and get over a big hump early and feel very good. Well, we never did get over the hump. And so we have postponed the production of specifications in this area pending further study and hoping there would be some marvelous creature arriving on the scene to illumine us on this issue. But it didn't come that way. It just came by rolling up our sleeves and sweating through it and talking and fussing at one another. And this is where we stand now. It looks pretty good to me. We came across an interesting statement in Process and Reality about hope and fear. And this seemed to be statements that reflected those earlier two basic states of the baby. Then later, we undertook a detailed study as a part of the analysis of the learning theories. O. Hobart Maurer O. Hobart Maurer's two-factor learning theory. It really is a wonderful book. Maurer writes magnificently, and he is one of the great psychologists of this century, in my opinion. I had a chance to talk with him for a long time at one point. He was at the University of Illinois. And a wonderful human being who has gone through many personal trials so that he has not seen psychology purely from an abstract, cognitive, intellectual point of view. He has worked through many serious issues in his own life, which in fact caused him to change some of his views about things. Well, in this two-factor learning theory, he talks about the guidance of behavior that stems from the person's own inner subjective experience as it is related to what he is doing at any given moment in time. It goes something like this. This is the example he gives, and we have taken this example and used it as the foundation of our organization of the affective area. If you are thrown in the water and you don't know how to swim, I seem to have lots of swimming analogies these days. You sense a great fear because there are too many unknowns facing you, like how am I going to keep my head above the water? And there is knowledge that if your head goes below the water and stays below the water, it's curtains. So you try something out. You flail and thrash around. Now, if you move your arms in a certain way, and your head comes above the water and seems to stay above the water while you're moving your arms in that way, then you begin to feel a little hope. And that directs you to keep on moving your arms in that way. On the other hand, if you're moving your arms this way, and it tends to make you sink, this will increase the fear, in which case you stop doing that. You try doing this then. And then your nose comes up above the water, you feel a little more hope, and that gets you to experiment and generalize with certain kinds of movement, and eventually that inner subjective state helps to guide what you are doing. So I decided that perhaps the chief function of emotions in man is to give a direct assessment of the degree of viability the organism is experiencing right now. Viability comes from the word vi, meaning life, and it means what are your prospects for survival? When you have wonderful prospects for survival, a category of emotions that we might call hopeful give you those kinds of cues. When the prospects for survival are dim, or remote, or unlikely, or improbable, then you have a variety of emotions that are on this side. Now, here is the objective of the affective process curriculum of the ENISA model. It is to get the hope emotions and the fear emotions organized in such a way that the emotional experience you have in any given moment in time reflect objectively as possible your real situation of viability. Now you can see, I think, here how pathology enters in. If you go into a situation which you should not be afraid of on any objective criteria, but you are in fact afraid, you are out of touch with the reality of that situation. And you are giving yourself a false reading of your own condition of viability. Likewise, if you go into a terribly dangerous situation and you're getting all kinds of positive feelings about things, like a child might crawling towards a boa constrictor because it moves and it looks interesting. He might be very excited and enthusiastic about this introduction of novelty, but it could be fatal. So there has to be, through time, a structuring of the emotions associated with cognition, where analysis and reason are, so that the two pull together. Now, Dot and I were just talking, coming from coffee, about Albert Ellis's idea of rational emotion. Is it emotional rational?
Rational emotive therapy.
Rational emotive therapy. It sounds kind of like what we're talking about here. We know that if people's emotions are poorly organized, their thinking tends to be pulled in directions. They are in a constant state of trying to rationalize things that won't rationalize. People who are bugged by irrational fears are people who really use a lot of emotions, a lot of energy, affective energy, in ways that do not help the organism continue to grow and develop. See, anytime energy gets misused, then that represents a slowing up of development. And that's what we try to avoid. That's what the whole Anissa thing is about. Now, a little bit later, when we talk about the organization of the self and values, and two major kinds of pathology, crime and mental illness, we do that on Monday, you'll begin to see how this figures prominently in the Anissa theory of therapy and rehabilitation. This rang a bell with me because of my own interest in stage fright. I started out as a concert pianist, as you know, and I worked with dancers in the stage and theater and performers. And one of the things that you always have to put up with when you're with those people is their coping with tremendous fears associated with performance. And I was always interested in noting the difference between those who kind of strolled out and did it without too much fuss, and those who flailed around and so on. And I noticed that those who flail around and fuss and are terrified are either terrified because they're not competent, and therefore they have a good reason to be afraid, or they have, for some reason, gotten out of touch with the real situation, and they have gotten their emotions organized wrongly. So, and for whatever reason, I think you could go back and find out why, and then you have to then organize a way of getting them reorganized. And I know lots of people who use that energy of fear that comes before a performance, they use it up in some kind of ritualized procedure, which seems to drain off the emotion and makes things more manageable. They might sit and tear little strips of paper, or some people wash their hands 500 times before the performance, or they change clothes 18 times. It's interesting, I've noticed it time and time again. Rituals which drain off energy, and people do. And when the rituals become very bizarre, then you think, you know, this person's a little... See? And the truth is, of course, if you made him give that up, he would be even worse, because that is sort of helping contain the energy. You see, it uses it up. And otherwise, it's got to go into shaking or something else. Well, at this point, let me just indicate some of the chief factors in getting the organization going right. By starting off telling you the sorts of things that make it go wrong, so those can be avoided at least. Injustice is perhaps the greatest destroyer of emotional stability. It means punishing a child when he didn't deserve it. Another damaging orientation in the organization to a child which organizes his emotions wrong is deception. You give him erroneous feedback. You don't tell him the truth. Or you associate with the truth all of the time a threat of punishment, so that he doesn't want the truth anymore, which will cause him ultimately to divorce himself from it. This is tricky business, you know, because if you want a child to tell you the truth and the child's stolen something, there's got to be some consequences from his having stolen something. And yet he probably knows that if he tells you the truth, he's going to be punished. So how do you arrange it so that he will tell the truth, take the punishment, and feel glad that he did it? That's tricky business. When we talk about, I don't know whether we're going to have, well, we will talk a little bit about the higher order competencies on Monday. And during that time, we're going to talk about moral competence and the moral development of the child and the moral values of the child. And that would be a good time to begin addressing that issue. You have a lot of questions. We don't have all the answers yet, but I think we have the fundamental theoretical basis to give you a good idea of the best things to try. And they may work for some children, not for others, but at least to know where to start, it's a great help, because if you start something, you get some feedback on it, and then you can modify what you're doing. If you're absolutely up a creek without a paddle, then you just feel immobilized and paralyzed and can't move, you see. So that's why that's important. Now, we are interested in finding ways of giving children experience so that joy and happiness and enthusiasm, awe and wonderment are facilitated. There are just too many people these days who can't enjoy anything. And in fact, they come to anticipate some wonderful event, and when the event arrives, it always bombs out for these people. They somehow do not have the capacity to just get in there and enjoy it with every goose pimple. They can't even get goose pimples. Now, if you have to go through life and you cannot have peak experiences of great enjoyment, we think that there has been a suppression of the actualization of affective potential. The truth of the matter is, those peak experiences are actually health-giving in a physiological sense. People who can enjoy, it has a psychosomatic good effect on the actual physical tissues. Now, some of you are probably familiar with the work of Abraham Maslow. There was a force in psychology called third force psychology, made up of people like Carl Jung and Maslow, and so on, who suddenly realized that most of what we knew about man from the discipline of psychology came through examining pathological cases. So these guys got together and said to themselves, why don't we go out and find the best put together people, the happiest, most productive, the kindest, the most cooperative, the most noble, the most creative, the most imaginative, the nicest people we can find who are healthy, happy, and going places. Let's get them together and examine them. And see if that won't give us a more decent perspective on man, rather than looking at all of these neurotic, broken down, psychotic, unhappy, abysmally miserable, depressed human beings. It was a marvelous idea. So that's what they did. They started looking at these happy, wonderful people. And they found out that one of the characteristics of these kinds of people is a capacity to enjoy an occasion from the bottom of their toes to the tip of their head. And they are not afraid to let go and enjoy something right now. See, there are a lot of people who can't enjoy anything now. They only expect to enjoy something in the future, but you see, when the future becomes now, since they, by definition, are people who can't enjoy now, that always is a disappointment. Now, there is a problem in having people only be able to enjoy the present, because they never think of the future. And of course, if you don't plan a little bit for the future, then of course the present tends to get tricky. So you can't be a 100% hedonist, but you ought to be able to enjoy now, most of the time. In those moments when you can't enjoy now, in the present, then you have to see what it is and why it is you have to do what you're going to do that you're not enjoying for the sake of preserving and safeguarding a future towards which you are moving. But people who live only in the future never live. People who only live in the present usually have a messy present because they didn't plan. People who live in the past are dead, psychologically. The present has no meaning, just a rehearsal of the past. So, from an Anissa point of view, these emotions need to be organized so that the past is realistically assessed and perpetually reinterpreted for the sake of negotiating the present with a view to a good future. And there's got to be that organization around past, present, and future in the way you feel about things, such that there is a motivation for continual growth and development. If things get organized in another way, then energy gets deployed in ways that make you interact with the environment, which then turns out to be suppressive of your potentialities. Freud had an interesting notion, the idea of cathexis, which in a broad general sense refers to an investment, an emotional investment of some kind, which we put into something else. Now, if you have learned to respond emotionally negatively to something that is good for you, you have then organized that part of your life in ways that will not support your further growth and development. Freud analyzes a case. I think it's the case of little hands. Would that be right, Dorothy? This is the case of of the I may be wrong, but I'll just tell you what the case is. It may not be Freud, but it illustrates the point. They show a little boy a white rabbit, and then they provide a noxious stimulus at the same time, so that there is a negative emotional arousal occurring at the same time as being with the rabbit. Now, of course, what happened is exactly what you would expect to happen if you have any sense at all, namely that the child comes to dislike rabbits. Now, this is not some great tragic in the kid's life, because if you don't have anything to do with rabbits for the rest of your life, chances are that's not going to be a great suppressant of your potentiality. But there is a natural tendency and inclination for human beings to generalize. What happens when the child generalizes first to everything furry, and secondly to everything that's white? Then you begin to have problems. Now, there's an interesting study on generalization, just to give you an example of a concrete study. On white children usually flip into a fit when they go to see a barber. Usually young boys, little boys. Well, one study showed that every time a child went to a barber and went into a big fit, it was because the barber wore a white robe and the kid had had a previous experience with a physician that had given him a shot. So the child is making an association between men who wear robes and hurt. So we have the obligation in Anissa to help a child come to organize emotions in a way that have rational basis. And our specifications on affective development are going to be elucidations going about that. They will have to do with things such as the management of anxiety. In fact, we do have a specification on the management of anxiety. It's about that thick. And we have to find some way of trimming it down and making it more digestible. But if you cannot gain control of and manage anxiety, in this day and age, you're in deep trouble. And living in a perpetual state of anxiety is living in a perpetual state of emergency. And the problem with anxiety, which is a derivative of fear, is that it does not have any object. So you are in a state of emergency without knowing exactly what the emergency is. And if you don't know what the emergency is, you don't know when to declare it over. In which case, you just get worn out. When you are anxious, adrenaline is going into the system. When adrenaline is going into the system, there are influences from that hormone on blood pressure. And if it goes on for too long, you may develop cardiovascular problems. There are implications for the way the vagus nerve functions. You know, the vagus nerve is a big long nerve that starts up here and goes down and goes through the heart, lung, liver, and stomach. It just kind of wanders down. This comes from the same word as vagabond. It means wandering, like a vagabond. It has a big nerve. And of course, one of the treatments for ulcers is to cut that branch of the nerve off that goes to the stomach, which keeps pouring hydrochloric acid or whatever else it is into the stomach, which causes the stomach to begin to digest itself, which makes the hole or the ulcer, you see. That's why there's got to be some way of managing anxiety. And part of that management has to do with the advanced stages of psychomotor competence. Because to reduce blood pressure means to cause the muscles in the walls of the arteries and vessels to relax. And we can now teach somebody voluntarily to relax the muscles in the walls of the arteries and blood vessels such that they can voluntarily reduce their blood pressure and bring it down to normal. We can also train a person to slow the heart rate without taking any drugs. Now, since drugs often have so many bad side effects, this is going to be a much better way of managing these problems. It'll make the pharmaceutical companies mad at us, but if we teach everybody how to reduce their own blood pressure, you don't have to have tranquilizers anymore. You don't have to have any of those drugs that are designed to make you go to sleep, because we also have some exercises which enable you to clear the mind of those kinds of emotional upsets such that sleep follows naturally without taking medication. Because, you know, it just wears the system out to take Sominex and then take an amphetamine when you get up. So you just, you know, you're knocking yourself out and you wake up feeling like death warmed up, or maybe death cold, and then you have to take an amphetamine to get yourself jazzed up. And then, of course, when you go to bed, you're like this, so you have to take more. You know, that's what half of America is on. Well, that is really heading in the wrong direction from our point of view. And Dr. Raman, the biochemist on our staff, actually gave up his profession, a very promising profession he had, because he is a first-rate researcher in biochemistry. And he belonged to a major pharmaceutical house, research unit. And when that company decided to invest practically all of its research and its whole marketing and production operation into the manufacturing of tranquilizers, he said, this is no way to go. Everybody will be taking a tranquilizer with his breakfast cereal. And the breakfast cereal will be made out of artificial foods, artificially colored and artificially flavored. And pretty soon, we will have worked ourselves into a situation where we have placed ourselves out of charge of our own destiny. We have abdicated the throne of pursuing our own destiny. And we will be depending on all these other agents, chemical agents, to keep us going. He heard of Anissa. He came down from Canada. We were hunting for a biochemist. He joined the staff, gave up that career. it's worse than you think. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could, through the ANISA curriculum, help bring into being a generation of young people who are organized emotionally such that their basic rational orientation to the environment and to their lives enables them to manage the biggest challenges because they're competent learners. And you see, if you're a competent learner, you never get yourself into the worst pickles anyway because you can always think your way out of it. And as you think your way out of a situation, you feel hopeful. And as you feel hopeful, anxiety goes. And as anxiety goes, you don't have all these terrible assaults on the system. It's all connected together. So I wanted to just give you that little bit of flavor about the affective part of the curriculum. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about reward and punishment. Because a teacher does this in some way, shape, or form. And its relationship to the organization of emotions. Because you can really get disorganized if you're not careful on that score. Mag, do you want to add anything to that since you're the big expert in the Western Hemisphere?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment. The expert is declines. All right, well, I told her that today she has, since she's the affective area, there's nobody that knows more about it than Mag. And since she has also recently read practically all of the literature on theories of teaching and pedagogy, that she is under orders from the boss to hold up cue cards over there to keep me from forgetting most of the important elements. And usually after I think of one, in the course of talking about one, the next one comes to mind. But that may not happen so on the pedagogical stuff. So I'm not as sure of my territory there in terms of having overlearned the area because Mag hasn't briefed me properly. So she'll have to do it in public here. Did you go get your notes? Sure. Okay. If she's ready, I'm ready. Yes. Now the next area I want to talk about a little bit is volition. When we first started ANISA, well, not when we first started, but when we first got our $250,000 grant and the first team got assembled and we started working, and we went through the literature to try to decide what these categories would be, they were all messed up. But as we gained more and more information and we thought, and we tried to relate everything to first principles and we began slowly building the theory, in those early days it really was kind of hair-raising because we had so many conflicts and we just couldn't get things hooked together. Well,
I just want to add, I've relearned the model 3 times.
Well, hang on, there may be another 50 times ahead. Oh, but you came on at a time when things were safe and well organized. Oh, yes, you didn't know the way it was, but you should have seen it before.
Maybe I did. Well, I was messy when I joined.
Oh, well, I mean, everything is relative.
Yes,
You,
exactly.
I mean, that was like the calmest order by the time you were.
When we first started the model, I wanted to say the other day that creativity was still considered an area of potentiality 3 years ago, or 4 years ago.
Oh, well, that was pretty messy then when you came in. I take it back. Time has flown by faster than I thought.
Because I've seen the transition around that issue in the...
Yes.
And the...
Well, that did clear a lot of things up when we finally saw creativity in and you see, we knew that White had said it was the universal of universals. It should have cued us that it applies to everything, but you know, you just don't make those connections until you bang your head against a brick wall, and if you don't destroy your brain cells, you can finally think up a new thought, you can get on the way.
But then I think Dick has made another important assertion, that is that he hasn't been too disoriented and disorganized by seeing the transition and growth.
Well,
and
yes.
development because, again, that's the release of potentiality on everybody's part. You know, if they're willing to keep growing with the thing.
Well, I don't mind that really, because it's the living proof of our good intentions to hunt for the truth. And therefore we don't mind changing. But we wouldn't change arbitrarily. We'd have to have a good reason for it. And it's getting harder and harder to find a good reason, which is a sign that the model's begun to settle down and behave properly, and we're willing to assume at least we're relatively close to the truth. Well, when we first started the model, volition was always there. In fact, when I started working on it way back in 1962, I had volition and will in the original conception. So it's been there from the beginning. And I was interested in that because I saw the difference as a therapist in patients who thought they had some control over things. I saw a change in their therapy the minute they thought they had some say over things. And I also found it almost impossible for the person to get well until he began to feel that he had some power, that he could make some decisions, that he could intend things and carry them through to a conclusion. And then, of course, if you look at the great philosophers, will and free will are always hair-raising issues that they've wrestled with and struggled with, and so on. Well, when psychology more or less broke away, from philosophy and set up its own empirical discipline, presumably, it borrowed the Newtonian model, which was mechanistic. And therefore, its way of dealing with the problem of will is to simply say it didn't exist. Namely, the position was that human beings are like everything else in the universe. Everything they do is caused by something else, not themselves. Therefore, will doesn't have any meaning. In other words, the Newtonian classical physics approach enabled the psychologist to get off the hook if he's going to take that model and just say that will doesn't exist. And therefore they explain behavior in terms of external forces always. You're thirsty, therefore you have to have water. And of course, thirst, from my point of view, is an internal state. But you can say that you can build a bigger mechanistic case around thirst than you can around some other things. Well, when I later went into a detailed study of Whitehead, and he said the major shift in conceptual thinking about the universe was moving from a mechanistic theory to an organismic theory, and the chief distinguishing feature of that move was the reintroduction of the subjectivist principle, or what he called subjective aim, or if you want, subjective will. I felt confirmed in putting volition right in there. Because not having it would be a violation of the organismic view. It would be having the subjectivist principle missing. So the fact that volition is in the Anissa model rests squarely on that fundamental shift in philosophical thinking in the latter part of the 19th century, away from a mechanistic conception of the universe to an organismic one. So it's not just something tacked on this model. It sits right in there as one of the kingpins. Now, we talked a little earlier about how the model has changed from the time Dick came on board in MAG 2. As things look now, because of Whitehead's emphasis of the subjectivist principle, that volition is going to be somewhere in the middle as the chief organizing principle. Now, this shouldn't surprise anybody, because if you look at the attention specification, which is the first one we gave you, this is a foreshadowing or a hint of that position emerging, because we know that no learning takes place if you're not paying attention. And therefore, it's got to be right in the center of things. You only learn what you pay attention to. Now, the question is, can you be in charge of attention? Some people are more in charge of attention than others. This is what we mean by concentration. If every little stimulus that appears in the environment simply takes you over there, you are less in charge of attention. And that means, in a sense, your will is a little bit flabby. If you can be easily dissuaded from doing something and having your attention taken off it, it is very difficult for you to progress in an orderly fashion in your own growth and development. Now, this is precisely what happens to a hyperkinetic child or a child who suffers from minimal brain dysfunction. And probably sometime in the fall, in one of the workshops, we'll have Dr. Raman come down to give you a full presentation on minimal brain dysfunction and the ANISA approach to that. And we will be working with Ann Louise and Ruth and so on, George and Dorothy and so on, about this. Let them have that. Dobby and I have just co-authored an article on minimal brain dysfunction and the ANISA method of approaching it. And it's a good solid article. It has an outline in there for how you approach the diagnosis and treatment of a child who is thought to have minimal brain dysfunction. It's going to be published in the fall issue of School Review. So we'll have another reprint for you on this very critical issue. Now, when it all comes down to it, the MBD child has lost volitional control. And yet he seems very willful. He's sadistic to animals. He seems impervious to affection. He won't obey. And he is distracted. He cannot hang on to one thing for very long. He sees something over there that attracts his attention. He jumps over there. There's a loud noise over here. He immediately jumps and goes over there. So he doesn't learn very much. And of course, these fear emotions are generated all the time. And it looks as if something has happened to the reticular formation in the brainstem. There's a certain part of the brainstem called the reticular formation. Reticular means net-like. And in that part of the brainstem, there seems to be an incredible network of crossing of nerves. It's very complex anatomical structuring of the nerves in that part. And that seems to be the part of the brainstem that determines the level of arousal. And therefore, it has something to do with attention. It is that part, we think, of the brain that sorts out and screens out everything coming into you. You see, if I had to attend to everything going on here, I would be aware of the machine going around and making a sound. I would be aware of the little bit of noise that comes from these lights. I would be aware of every little movement that you make, every little sound, every little shift. Well, you could just be out of your mind trying to attend to everything. You cannot attend to everything. You must select. What happens when you can't select? Because selection means attention, and attention is an expression of volition. If you're going to be in charge of it. If you don't have any volitional competence, then the bigger the stimulus will be the thing that attracts your attention. So if you have a brighter light over there, that'll get you. If you make a loud noise over here, that'll get you. But you won't be in charge, and you will be more dependent on the environment, and it will be the efficient causes will be determining your behavior, will be causing the efficient causes will be the determinants of your behavior, and not the final causes, not your intention and purpose, you see. So volition is that category of the model that deals with intention, aim, and purpose. And not only were we interested in it because of attention and the reticular formation as a part of the brain, but the front part of the brain here, which is called the telencephalon, seems to be a very important part anatomically and physiologically of the brain when it comes to mediating the subjective experience of intention and will and purpose. And yet you can have the prefrontal lobes removed and life does not stop, nor is necessarily your memory impaired particularly. But I was interested in some studies which showed that you could not artificially or experimentally induce neuroses in prefrontal lobectomized monkeys. This is a lobe, L-O-B. T-O-M in Greek means to cut, and ek means to cut out and throw away. Ot, O before otomy, means to just cut. So if you have a tracheotomy, you just make a hole. If you have a tracheectomy, you actually cut part of the trachea out. So when you have a lobectomy, they actually cut the lobe out and they stuff a nylon sponge in there to fill up the vacuum. But you don't do that ordinarily. Most operations on the brain are lobotomies. They just cut the frontal lobes off and they leave them in there. Now, they don't cut all the blood vessels. Otherwise, it would just kind of rot in there. You'd have the New York situation on your hands. Your breath would begin to smell like you'd have to have more than a mouthwash. You'd have to have a brainwash. You've heard of brainwashing, have you? What is a new kind of brainwashing? You know that the Greeks used to think that hysteria was caused by the female organs, and therefore to get rid of them, you had to cut them out, which was called a hysterectomy. See? Now, that was obviously a male-dominated scheme of thought, because nobody has come up with what you should do if the male becomes hysterical. This would be something of a problem. Well, here's the interesting thing to me. When I came across those studies about the what did you say, Matt? She's got a suggestion, I can tell. Well, I don't think we will entertain your suggestion at the moment. When I came across these studies that showed you could not create neuroses in monkeys who had the prefrontal lobes cut off, the question is, why not? Well, the way you create neuroses in an animal is to frustrate his intentions. And a good way to drive a human being up the wall is to frustrate his intentions. Another way of saying that is to undermine his purposes. If you have set an objective up here, and you note that in the volitional specification, goal setting is what comes after attention. If you set a goal up here, that goal then becomes your purpose, and it functions as final cause because you organize your life around it. It determines what you do then. Of course, if you haven't got one, then something else organizes it. But if you have an objective, a goal, a purpose, that tends to organize and therefore cause your behavior to go in that direction as opposed to in this direction. Now, supposing you're trying to get there and something comes in the way, an obstacle, other people. This part of the brain seems to be very important in interpreting the suppression or the obstacle In other words, the subjective awareness of how well you are doing in regard to your objectives seems to be mediated in large part by the frontal lobes. Now, if you have repeated obstacles there, you will have a lot of these fear emotions organized, and you will come to feel like the viability of the organism, of you yourself, the viability is reduced, and you will then make struggles to try other things to get around that problem. But what if you can't? Eventually, you will become depressed. And if nobody relieves the depression, you will become suicidal. And if nobody relieves suicidal depression, eventually you will try it. And chances are you'll be successful. People who talk about committing suicide usually try it. Almost everybody who has committed suicide has given the signals to others. It is not true that if you talk about it, you won't do it. The quickest way to surgically get rid of suicidal obsession is simply to cut off the frontal lobes. I don't mean cut the blood vessels now. You want to keep it alive, but you just want to cut all the nerves that associate the frontal lobes with the rest of the brain. If you cut off the prefrontal lobes, you do not feel anxious anymore or depressed. Because if your depression came from frustrations of your intentions, you now don't have any major intentions anymore. It's a wonderful relief. There is built into each one of us then a kind of divine discontent for becoming something better than we are now. And a lot of our frustrations in life come from hanging on to that. It's what makes us human. But when it gets too bad, and there's no relief, then you'd rather die than stay alive. That's what martyrs do, you see. They say, I want this, I believe this, I must have this. My whole life, my whole value system is organized around that. If I can't have it, I'd rather be gone. And therefore, they're martyred. This is a uniquely human attribute. You can't imagine some dog being cornered and standing on his values and saying, well, kill me. I believe this. No, the dog gets the heck out of there. He'll, no matter what, he'll get out of there to save his skin. But human beings sometimes don't. They'll face the firing squad first. Now, it would be an interesting empirical study to take people who are insisting on martyrdom and cut off their prefrontal lobes and see if they'd give it up. Chances are they would. They'll say, well, before the operation it seemed so important, but now it doesn't seem important at all. That's it. I'll give it up. Don't shoot me. Well,
If you worked with lobotomized patients, you'll find out they don't care about anything.
that's right. Have you ever had?
Yes, I worked
Yes.
with
How about you?
I met a man who wasn't in the hospital anymore. He was running a summer place in Vermont with his wife, and he just didn't seem to, as you say, he could talk and about everything that had ever happened to him. He told you about the lobotomy, but he didn't seem to have any affect at all.
That's right.
Well, the electric shock therapy is not quite as severe as the
But it does a
lobotomy.
similar
It
thing
does-
in a way.
Yes.
But it often comes back, and that's why you have to go back for treatment in a year or something. Yes.
What about drugs? They have effect on volition.
Drugs undermine volition. And because one of the functions of volition is perseverance, and escaping into the drug world makes that unnecessary. And so that function is nearly gone. And so that's why drugs are bad news. Yes?
There's an article in Psychology Today this month around creativity and drugs and TM incident. I heard TM terms of creativity is you've got on a point of 1 to 10, you should be around 5 in terms of energy level in order to be creative. If you've got too much stress within your body, then creativity tends to get blocked. And if you're very placid and
It doesn't get off the ground.
calm, and TM has this kind of thing as drugs sometimes too,
Yes.
of just taking the stress out of the organism.
Yeah.
So the article offers that contending that it's kind of an in the middle thing, and I think lobotomy's kind of put you down to a 1 on the scale of 10.
Yes.
Is thumb sucking a neurosis like in children?
No, not necessarily. There's a lot of studies on thumb sucking and the relationship to weaning in the breastfeeding operation. But the reason for thumb sucking is that when you are sucking the breast as a baby, the hope emotions are high because you assess the condition of viability as very good. After all, you're against a warm bosom. That's why breastfeeding is so much more important, because it's hard to get too enthusiastic about a Playtex bottle. But anyway, yeah, that's better than not having anything to eat. I'm trying to speak from a child's point of view, you understand. So, when I'm hoping I'm having the grace to blush and it's coming out on the videotape. What? Now, in the absence of the nipple and the breast, a child would have a substitute that would help him to have those same hope emotions. So in the thumb goes. And you'll notice that a thumb-sucking child goes to the thumb-sucking the minute there's stress. And this is the way they try to bring back the conditions of feeling good and viability, by simulating suckling, you see. Now, there are a lot of studies on it. We won't have time to go into it now, but let me just say one point. If you wean a child prematurely, they will almost certainly be thumbsuckers. If you fail to wean the child at all, they will also become thumbsuckers. So you want to try to, the studies show you should kind of do it in the middle somewhere. And that middle may be different from different children.
The studies never had any children.
The studies never had any children. Well, these are, for instance, at the lab school at the University of Chicago. And we have a person in the room who went there and graduated from there. I don't know whether they took information on you about thumb sucking and weaning and toilet training, but they did.
I wasn't there for that period.
You weren't there for that period. But most of the people who came into the lab school at the University of Chicago had detailed statements taken from parents on weaning, toilet training, thumb sucking, all those things. And they later did studies on puppies on weaning and on whether puppies would suck on a dummy teat. And all puppies who got weaned too early would spend part of the day just sucking on a dummy teat, whereas those who were weaned naturally by the mother dog did not suck on the dummy teats. So there seems to be some, I mean, these general statements rarely apply to an individual case 100%, you see. But so that's why Whitehead says it is very important. It's very important intellectual activity to make generalizations, but at the same time to find in specific instances reflections of the general case. And you got to be careful. You can't impose the generalization on a specific case because it may not work. But the only way thumb sucking becomes in the direction of neuroses is that if the child, in order to improve his condition, withdraws and sucks his thumb instead of getting out there and doing whatever it is needed to do in order to handle the situation, then that becomes on the neurotic side of behavior because it's dysfunctional. I mean, it's not a use of energy which is helping him. for a child, I mean, the thumb sucking thing is a fairly normal kind of thing if it's not carried too far. And you know, some people say that Winston Churchill, that cigar he had all the time, that's nothing but a pacifier. See, he didn't light it up much of the time. And in fact, there is a correlation between people who smoke and when they were weaned. Then they say that there's an oral drive associated with that. Now, that may be something that you wouldn't all agree with. I'm just telling you what the studies are. You can decide for yourself. See, if you stop smoking, you have to suck on lifesavers. You have to do something with your mouth to sort of. Oh, Jesus! I didn't notice anybody was smoking now, so you forgive me. Now, here's an interesting thing. This word "tell" comes from a Greek word, and you find it in telencephalon, and you find it in teleology. And teleology simply means pertaining to purpose, and therefore pertaining to final cause. And I think the word also looks at purpose and final cause as something out there from afar that beckons or lures. That's why Whitehead says it's talking always about the lure of an ideal or the lure of a purpose. So tell also has that as a prefix, has the idea of from afar. That's where we get television. It is vision from afar. Telephone. Phone is a sound from afar. Telegram. Gram means writing or a message. Graph means to write. Gram is what gets written. A telegram is a letter that's written from afar. See? So we've used those words to telepathy. Pathos means to feel, so telepathy means to feel from afar. Mental telepathy, so on.
I keep wondering why they don't teach Latin in school anymore.
Well,
it's so helpful because
it is absolutely helpful. Of course, this is Greek, but
right.
There's 150 things. But the point is still taken. Yeah, that's right. I couldn't resist it. It's all Greek to us anyway. Yes, right.
We'd be happy to just talk English.
It's such a vital thing, and it gives
Yes.
you so many derivatives and
Well, we're going to introduce this, as you will see, in the ANISA curriculum. Yes, we both know the derivations of the words in English. And the ANISA spellers will be organized around word families that belong to families because they are related, and they are related because they have the same ancestors. See, this will make spelling meaningful. It will increase their vocabularies and give them a very well-developed linguistic capacity. And you see it in the way we always explain things. We're very interested in explanations by looking at their derivations in their words. Well, what would you do differently in a school to make certain that a child's volitional competence is guaranteed? Well, there are lots of things, of course, and many of the process objectives of the ANISA curriculum cannot be accomplished by bringing the children together and saying, children, we are now going to have an exercise in volition. See, you just can't have volition 101 and memory 101 and attention 102, see, and projecting to sort of an ANISA high school. You might think that's the way people would do it. But unfortunately, that kind of thing violates the organismic point of view. The volitional competence gets attention from the teacher all through the day. Much of it comes from providing opportunities to make choices and decisions, which means to set objectives. And before you can set an objective, you have to pay attention to possibilities and select something. See? And that goes on through the entire day. And then to persevere and to be encouraged to finish. So one of the things an ANISA teacher has to do is that when a child decides to do something, he needs to clarify what he intends to do and let somebody else know, say the teacher or aides or whoever. And then the teacher or the supervising adult must see to it that the child finishes, that he consummates his intention. Because we have evidence that when you consummate an intention, that is to say you actually do what you set out to do, those hope emotions are activated. Now that's reasonable, because if you can accomplish what you set out to accomplish, this lets you feel like you have some power over things. And to have power over things makes you feel more hopeful than if you don't have any power over anything. And it is directly tied in to Robert White's notion of effectiveness again. If you know you can be effective, you arrive at that sense of your own effectiveness because you have the repeated experience of accomplishing what you decide to accomplish. Now, if you want to meet somebody who is without confidence and who doesn't have very high self-esteem and who is very anxious, meet a person who can't finish what they set out to finish. And you'll find a person that is generally not very well toned up and witted. And that is because they really are not in charge very well of their own destiny, because they can't accomplish what they set out to accomplish. Now, we've spawned a generation of such people. So that the American household is filled with projects begun but never finished. Here's a painting half done, here's a puzzle half finished, here's a dress half made, here's a couch half upholstered, here's a chair. You know, just the American houses are just filled with things half done. And so setting a goal is easier than finishing it. And then, of course, you have the repeated experience, I do, of getting very enthusiastic about what I'm going to get done today, and I make a list, and it seems like I've used all my energy in making the list. And now to actually do what's on it, you know, it's just another matter. Sometimes it's better not to make such a big list. Just do one thing and get it finished. And then make a list of the things you finished. I mean, that would be another way of trying. Yes, yes. And then cross it off. Well, making a list is planning, and that's good stuff ordinarily. But it does have to do with the distribution of energy. And a lot of people think once they've made the list, the job's done. And they can now have a coffee break, which goes on forever. And they don't have to get time to do something. Now, an important other feature of volition implicates individualization of instruction, which is a main pedagogical thrust of the model. And that has to do with making certain that the timing of children's activities is individualized such that it is possible for every kid to finish what he decides he's going to do. Even if you have a class of 30 kids and you have assigned the goal for them, which is perfectly legitimate for a certain percentage of the time, and then you expect everyone to finish at the same time, this is unfeasible and unrealistic. And what happens is the slower person will not finish. The bell will cut him off. The bell itself in American schools is one of the great destroyers of the individualization of instruction, because it presumes that every kid works at the same pace. And the evidence is overwhelmingly to the contrary. Now, what happens when you don't get to finish what you set out to do? There was a Russian psychologist named Zygarnik who carried out a number of studies on this. And she found that if you're not allowed to finish the task, there is a trace of a kind of a bugging. That you just want to have closure. That's why closure is the last sub-process of will. And people who never have a sense of closure leave everything up in the air all the time. Those who can't stand anything but closure always want to have things closed too soon. The important thing is to let enough time pass and then have closure at an appropriate time. Well, there is self-enjoyment that comes when you effect closure on something you intended to do. No matter how tiny it is, even if it's just polishing your shoes, there is a good sense when you intend to polish your shoes and you polish them. And then if you intend to do, you know, on days when you've got 20 million little things to do, there's a good feeling every time you get one done. But if your day is interrupted by 50,000 people and you don't get any of them done, you know, you'll all say, oh, this is going to be one of those days. You can tell it, you know, after the first 5 minutes. You see, oh, and the reason you say that is because you know there's going to be no end of frustration, that you will not be able to consummate your intentions, and therefore you won't have those nice little feelings after each one gets done. See? Now, supposing somebody came into your house on one of these Saturdays where you're going to get 5,000 things done, and just before you finished it, they rang a bell and said, sorry, you can't finish it. You have to go on something else now. And so you said, well, I'll make my dress today. So you just get the thing in the machine. You're just about ready to finish the hem. Somebody rings a bell. Said, sorry, now you have to go clean the basement. So now you go down the basement, you get the broom out, and you start working this. And you ring a bell, and you don't get the trash. There's just a heap of trash there. Well, supposing your whole day was like that. And then you had to go through not only every day like that, but you had to go through 12 years of it. What kind of person would you be at the end of that?
Ready
You would
to
be
get
a
out of education.
What? You'd what?
Ready to get out of education. I think the classroom teaching is that.
Now, we have to find an alternative to this very serious problem. Now, of course, the school day does have to end at some point. But you know, from an Anissa point of view, if we were really serious, there would be variable ending points. A child could come to you, theoretically, from an Anissa point of view, at 1:30 and say, look, teach, this is what I've done. I had a wonderful day. I've gotten this done, I've gotten this done, and I'm just kind of finished now, and it's time for, I want to go home. You should be able to look at the thing and say, sure, take off. Somebody else ought to be able to come at 4 and say, you know, I got another hour and a half work on this thing, and I really want to get this done before I go home. If we were doing it absolutely right and concerned about the children, then we would say, sure, you can stay for another hour and a half and finish this. To not allow a child to do it is to destroy the organismic quality of the experience. And that flies in the face of everything we know about life and viability. Now, when we ran the little Anissa school that summer, when 12 o'clock came and the parents came to pick up their children, there were maybe 20% at a natural breaking point, and they were ready to go. The other 60% or 80% who were in the middle of something did not want to go. And therefore we had the nasty job of breaking them away from what they're doing, which robs them of that good feeling of effectiveness, which arouses all those hope emotions and makes them feel like a person that can manage it, you see? So we've got a lot of work to do to decide how we're going to organize a real Anissa school, and we have some very definite views on how we can accomplish and accommodate this. And I feel the evidence so far, when we have tried this, and I can tell you about my own experiences with Upward Bound where I used this approach, the minute you do that, just on that one dimension alone, you boost productivity amazingly. And the wonderful thing is, unproductive energies just disappear. There's no property destruction. Even the language of the students, and these upward bounders came with a well-oiled vocabulary of 4-letter words. They had filthy mouths, and they cursed, and I never knew that shit had so many meanings until I worked with those children. They use it to express joy, contempt, hate, you know, really, awe, wonder, everything. This is marvelous. I found this was a marvelous word, as it turns out. I mean, I've listened to a group of those kids in a conversation, and they could talk nothing about shit and cover the whole gamut of emotions. Now, there wasn't too much cognitive, intellectual content, but they could sure communicate a wide range of feelings. But you know, at the end of the summer, the amount of cursing and what I would call useless verbiage expressing frustration just began to erode and disappear. And I had a rule on the staff that no cursing on the staff, because it's bad modeling. And you don't want to provide, we'd rather have the child's thought more productively used. And of course, if something goes wrong and you're frustrated, to curse relieves a certain amount of that pressure. But is there a more productive use of the energy, like doing it again and trying it over again, you see? Well, we think yes. And there is no doubt in my mind that if we set up the educational system right, you simply get these pathologies simply disappear. We didn't have any troubles by the end of it, by the end of that 6-week period with these delinquent kids. They were kind to one another. They had goodwill. They had enthusiasm. They had a sense of their own destiny beginning to blossom. And they were on it. But my staff was on call 24 hours a day. And after 14 days, we were just exhausted beyond belief. So it takes some energy to work with kids whose patterned use of energy goes in all the wrong directions, and to get them reorganized really takes some doing. And when we talk about the organization of the self, I'll give you some concrete examples about that. Well, these other questions, one has, what sustains the actualization of potentiality? You know, that's the interaction with the environment. You know what the definition of learning competence is. You know what it's, no, I'm on the wrong thing. You know how the content curriculum is organized. Number 5, how can you evaluate your content curriculum for early childhood education? Are there any modifications needed? Let me just give a guideline there. Ask yourself the question, is the information I want this child to get now going to be useful for his life in the future? Now, if your answer is, yes, I think it will be useful, you should ask yourself the next question, namely, is there any other information that would be more useful than this, that would fit in here? And if you can think of something more useful, then get rid of what you thought of first and substitute it with something more important. In other words, there is so much, we have only time for the most important. And we have some guidelines for that, which we'll be talking about during the coming year. But you can ask yourself that question, and once you begin thinking about it, you probably come up with some perspectives on it. What are the functions of the 3 basic symbol systems? Well, they are vehicles of memory, and therefore they help you build up the immanence of the child, and they also are used to help structure or give pattern to the use of your energy. And of course, these symbol systems are vehicles of the content curriculum, but they have implications for process too, because they help determine how the energy gets used in the patterns. Number 7, how are interactions classified in the ENISA model? And number 8, what are some specific ways to guide a child's interaction? Are more properly pedagogical questions, and I'm going to now put them over into the next session. When we come back from coffee, I'm going to define teaching, show how it is derived from the theory of development, and have a detailed explanation of what might be called pedagogical axioms of the ENISA model. These are general principles of teaching which put the flesh on that very concise definition of teaching such that would improve the power of anybody who uses them to improve his teaching. Okay, have a cup of coffee. Definition of teaching from the ENISA theoretical perspective. As in the case of curriculum theory, we found that there could be no comprehensive theory of teaching by itself, that it in fact had to be a derivative theory that would be related to a higher theory of some kind. And in the case of teaching, it not only has to be related to a higher theory, but it has to be related to a parallel theory, namely the theory of curriculum. The definition of teaching is derived from that basic proposition in the theory of development, that the translation of potentiality into actuality is sustained by interaction with the environment. And therefore teaching means arranging environments and guiding the child's interaction with the environment in order to achieve the objectives outlined in the curriculum. So if you haven't got a curriculum, teaching is going to be very difficult. Therefore, you can't have a theory of teaching that is independent from a theory of curriculum, because the curriculum specifies what it is you're trying to accomplish. The theory of teaching shows what you do, how you use your energies in order to help a child assimilate information on the one hand and become a competent learner on the other at the same time. The curriculum theory has an overlap with the teaching theory, and this overlapping area is the area of interaction, because the curriculum theory specifies in general terms what kind of interactions with what kinds of environments are required to achieve the objectives, and the theory of teaching is concerned with arranging those environments and guiding that interaction. We looked at our notion of learning competence and asked ourselves, given our understanding of that, how would we define teaching competence so that we have absolute parallel notions? It is the objective of the ENISA teacher preparation program to facilitate a person's becoming a competent teacher. In the case of learning competence, we said that it depended upon the conscious ability to differentiate, integrate, and generalize experience through these 5 modalities. Teaching competence then means the conscious ability to arrange environments and guide the child's interaction with him to accomplish a given objective. Now, there are a lot of teachers who know how to do it, and they are very gifted, but it's not conscious. And the problem with it not being conscious is that you can't explain it to anybody else, nor can you reflect on it very deeply, because to reflect on something means to raise it to the level of conscious awareness. And an experience that goes by unreflected upon is not going to be one that you can consciously build on. So I suspect we have lots of gifted teachers in many schools, and what they do is reasonably effective, but it could be made more effective if they had a conscious knowledge of what it is they did that was good, because then they could get rid of more things that they are doing that isn't so good, that aren't so good, thereby improving their teaching over time. When we get set up ultimately for a teacher preparation program, we're going to have two models of it. One is a kind of in-service operation where we have our own school, we're working with our own children, with our own carefully trained staff. And people who come to be trained in the ANISA system then will have the sessions on theory like we're having now, but they won't get it in such undigestible doses. They'll just get a little tiny bit at a time over a 3-year period. You realize what we're doing here today is a gross violation of what we believe in. It's too much to take. But it's better than nothing. So you always have to do things in the best way you can under the circumstances. But we will take a bit of the theory, a bit at a time. They'll have an overview, of course, and the overview will be rehearsed and repeated and so on. But on a daily basis, we'll take some part of the theory. They will then go in and work with the children under supervision of one of our master teachers, where they can see it happening, and they will get feedback. The student teaching, or what we call student teaching now, where you leave behind everything you've had from the professors and go out into some school somewhere and work with a supervising teacher for 6 weeks or whatever, will be a pattern that's broken. You can't really become a great teacher working in a spotty way under a supervising teacher who's terribly busy over a 5-week period. So our training program in ANISA will probably be a 4-year program to just train a teacher. But when they leave us, they will be good teachers. Our master's program will be designed to produce specialists and master teachers. These will be teachers who are the main orchestrators of the experience of children, and they also have administrative functions of working with specialists and guiding the activities of specialists. And I have some things to show you about administrative arrangements in that regard. For us, the master teacher is one of the highest paid people in the system. As we organize affairs now, the only way you can reward a teacher financially is to make an administrator out of them. But if their big strength is working with children, it's a shame to stick them in the office then shuffling papers. And since the main objective is to actualize the potentialities of children by making them competent learners, when you get somebody who's a master at that, that body of knowledge and skill is equal to or greater than what an administrator has to know. And therefore, why shouldn't there be compensation on that level? Well, we think that those people who can do that are worth the most. Well, we don't think that, of course, in the way things are set up now, because we don't provide rewards for super teachers. Well, they might get tenure. They might get a little raise here and a little raise there. But you don't see those teachers right at the top of the pay scale. And that's where we think they ought to be. Because they're the ones directly involved in the lives of those children. And if that's what the objective of the system is, then that's where the best talent is required. And that's where you ought to be able to pay for it. So we have a lot of battles to fight to get ANISA going in any system. Because it just flies in the face of so many traditional ways of going about things. But it flies in the face of them not arbitrarily. There's a good, solid reason for everything we do. And we have talked with large numbers of people, as I indicated before, and we haven't found anybody that has come up with alternative kinds of reasoning that are sounder than what we have generated to support the position we have. Now, you know yourself how damaging it is for a child to be stuck with a teacher for a whole year and maybe have that teacher undermine that child's academic future. It happens to lots of kids, and the evidence is it happens to around 1 million children every year in this country. So that we have about 15 million youngsters being derailed, some in the process of completing the derailment, others just beginning it. Now, if you start in the system and you get messed up by a teacher because she didn't fit you and whatever happened, not because the teacher is malicious. I don't think, I've met very few malicious teachers. I think most of them do have good intentions. But in some cases, they're not good teachers. But it's very difficult to expect somebody to realize that they're not a good teacher and at the age 56 decide to go into another profession, although this is exactly what a mature person would do. And in fact, in the course of our training programs in a variety of places over the last 3.5 years, we had a person, a very good person in terms of moral sense, come to us after 1.5 years of ANISA training and saying, I now understand why I am not a good teacher, and I don't think I can become one in the time I have left. And since an early retirement is open to me, I'm going to remove myself from the system and let somebody else come in who can do it better. Now, that's a sign of a good person. Now, of course, we have a counseling system built into our program when we get it going, where people go through a set of experiences early in the game where they can sense whether or not this is where their strength is in teaching. And if it's not, then they be counseled into something else. As it is now, you go through the whole thing. You go into your student teaching, you've invested 4 years in it. Well, who's going to give it up then? See, maybe you should have been a dentist. Maybe you should have been a vet. Maybe you should have been an engineer. But after 4 years of preparing for this career, and then find out at the end that it's not for you, well, you know, that's the wrong time to make decisions, though I think maybe you wouldn't have enough information to make a decision until you'd finished the whole thing, in which case, for heaven's sakes, stop and start over. It can be done, and it's worth it. I made that decision when I gave up music. Start all over again from ground zero. And you see, as long as you feel like you're in hot pursuit of your destiny, time is not really the issue. Because clock time is one thing and calendar time, but time in terms of one's life and what you do with your energies is the important thing. And to heck with the calendar time and the clock time, see. If you're doing what you can do best in this world to fulfill all of your capacities and potentialities, and it takes a while to find out where they are, all well and good. That's okay. Now, I know that the society doesn't think about that or regard it very highly, and I remember after I'd given up a career in music, in composition, and started all over, I called my mother once. I have 5 brothers and 2 sisters, so she has a lot of chicks to look after, and about 35 grandchildren and 6 or 7 great-grandchildren. I have a whole flood of grandnieces and nephews and so on. But it's amazing how somebody like my own mother sort of keeps track of all of that. Anyway, I called her to tell her that I'd gotten a scholarship at the University of Chicago, and I was now starting all over in a new field and everything else, and there was this kind of silence on the other end of the phone. And she said, well, that sounds pretty nice, honey, but when are you going to get a job and start work? I said, Mom, this is going to be work. But she said, you know what I mean. And she thought, and I'd just gotten married, you see. I'd just gotten married and starting all over again, so it just seemed like, well, you ought to be out there working and getting a good solid paycheck every week. And you can pursue your destiny later. Not now you want to get a job, see. Well, you see, if you don't have any destiny in mind, then yes, get a job and get a paycheck. But if you've got a destiny in mind, then that's something else. It's worth making the shift, you see. Well, I want to look now at the idea of the arrangement of environments in very general terms, and then talk about assessing developmental levels and the individualization of instruction. This is what the theory is designed to do. Nothing derails a child more quickly than being forced to undergo a set of experiences that are not fitting him. Now, if you make a child have a set of experiences repeatedly that don't fit him, first of all, those fear kinds of emotions, those anxiety kinds of things begin to get generated. Now, pretty soon, the child comes to just associate the smell of the school and being inside it with those kinds of sick feelings. I know so many people who just kind of feel vomitous at the sight of the school. To just come in and smell the carpets and the chalk, just the smell of the wax they use on the floor, everything about it, the sounds that go on there, the sight of a desk and pencils and pencil sharpeners and globes and dictionaries and papers, just bad news. So that even if you want to turn everything around, you now have to retrain all those emotions. And this is the most difficult job of all. Once negative emotions have been organized around something, to get that association broken and reorganized has got to be one of the most difficult operations we know of. That's why therapy and rehabilitation are such nasty jobs. They're hard to do. So at all costs, teachers need to avoid that. That's what Whitehead, I love that statement Whitehead said, the first thing a teacher has to do is to make, when the kids come into class, is to make them glad to be there. Now I want to give you some tentative studies that I've done to show you how desperate this situation can get. When I was working with these upward bound students at Indiana State, I was interested in finding out whether or not the experiences I was providing for them, based on some of the early ANISA principles as I had formulated them way back then. This is 1965, 66, 67. I wanted to see whether or not the self and their view of their own self was actually being changed by this 8-week experience at Indiana State University campus. With myself and the rest of the staff, I had 80 of those kids. And they came from the kinds of backgrounds I've already mentioned: broken homes, had been in detention homes, they'd had bad encounters with the police, they had usually bad relationships with their parents, and school was bad news for them, by and large. I came across a set of studies on the behavior of the pupil of the eye. Now, you know, the pupil of the eye is really just the hole. And it just looks black, but the reason it looks black is because the inside of the eyeball doesn't have much light in it, and therefore it's dark. But it's just, after all, you know, a physician can get a little instrument, he gets right down there, and shines a light in there, and he can see what's going on inside the eye. The part around it, called the iris, is a muscle which can close the hole and make it get wider. And it usually does this to regulate the amount of light that comes in. So that if I were turning off the lights right now, immediately everybody's pupil would dilate to let more light in. The minute I turn them on, everybody's pupil comes back down. Now, when you go to have an eye examination, the physician wants to shine a light in your eye to look into it. Of course, the minute he shines the light in there, it closes up. It gets very tiny. So they put a drug in there called belladonna, which relaxes the muscles, so that you can't do that when he shines the light in there, and therefore he can explore all around. And of course, that means for the rest of the day you're going around kind of fuzzy, because you need to keep out some of that light in order to see well, you see. Well, I came across some studies which showed that the behavior of the pupil of the eye is very interesting in that the eye will try to close out things that it's not too keen on, and that it opens up when it sees something that the organism likes. So that if you look at something that really interests you, the pupil opens just temporarily. It'll go back down to the normal size regulated by the amount of light, but when it sees something that it really likes, it opens up. And it's interesting how cartoonists and people somehow, we sort of know that intuitively, because we have all these expressions in cartoons of people seeing something that attracts them and their eyes pop out. Well, our eyes don't actually pop out. Sometimes they do get bigger and brighter, but the real thing is that the pupil gets bigger and lets in more light. Now, the converse is also true. When you see something that you don't like, the pupil temporarily constricts, and then it goes back out to the normal range. I had 3 colored slide photographs taken of each of those students, dressed up, looking as good as they could. And I picked the best one with the child, let him pick the one he liked best. And I wanted to see what each person's pupil would do when he saw his own self, thinking that if the pupil went open, the kid likes himself. If it constricts, he's not too sure about himself. So I had a graduate student named James Keene, who's now went on to great glory and is now a neurophysiologist at the University of Puerto Rico, but he was a Woodrow Wilson Fellow and went to the University of Michigan and worked with James Olds, and he's an expert on brain structure, brain chemistry, and its relationship to emotion and memory and learning and so on. And he was a good friend of mine, and he came down to help me work on this little study. So he constructed a black, I was going to say a black box, I mean just a box. And it has a hole in it there with a little chin rest. And you could put your head into that box and clamp down and hold it there. And we had a partition, a wall right here, so that I could stand here with a wall like this, so that the person who's got his head in this box doesn't see me here. And we had a binocular microscope that went in to the box and right underneath where his eye was. On the rear end of the box back here, we had a screen, and we had a carousel. This is a rear view projection screen where so that when I would look through these two, through the microscope, I would see his eye, and I could observe the behavior of the pupil as it moved back and forth. And the interesting thing is, when the eye is blown up that big and you watch it, the pupil is going like this. I was very surprised. I thought that, it would just kind of stay like that, and it would get big and get small, but it's kind of like a wave motion. It's going sort of up and down, and it's moving an awful lot, more than you think it is when you just look at somebody, because when it's blown up, the movement gets exaggerated. Now, I could tell what picture the person was looking at on this rear view screen, because we had it arranged so that off the cornea of the eye was an inverted reflection of the picture. So I could tell by looking on his eye, I could tell what picture he was looking at because it would be reflected right off the eyeball itself. Now I had a whole set of pictures. I had pictures of horses, of motorcycles, of grassy green areas, hiking in the mountain. I had pictures of dictionaries, books, chalk, cap and gown, globes, rulers, pencils, pens, chalk, erasers, teachers, and lockers, libraries, dictionaries, all that kind of thing. Plus the picture of the child himself, the student himself, in there somewhere. And I watched what his eye did as it saw each one of these pictures. Well, we didn't have a chance to carry this study through to a detailed conclusion, but we collected enough data to show that, generally speaking, kids who hated school had, if they hated it bad enough, when they saw all those things, the minute they came on the screen, the eye would go down like this. And the worst of it was when the picture of the kid himself came on, to watch his eye reject himself. Because those who really had what you would call a bad self-image, when the picture came on, excuse me, when his own picture came on, his eye would constrict and try to screen him out. And we wanted to use this as a measure. See, we did it at the beginning of the program, then we did it at the end to see if there were changes in what they did, and there were changes. You can imagine then that if a negative experience is powerful enough to unconsciously control the dilation and constriction of the pupil of the eye, that's going to be a hard thing to undo. And it was hard to undo. You know it's hard to undo. And therefore, how can we avoid it, prevent it from happening? Now we did another thing. We took some of the students and we had a little cup here into which some money could fall from a little channel down here. You can see what we're about to try out. We would shine the picture of the child himself, of the student himself, and at the same time we would turn, and this would be a child who would ordinarily constrict the pupil when he saw himself. At the minute it came on, we would turn the light down on the inside of the box, which meant that the counter tendency would be to open up the pupil because it got darker inside the box. So that when the light came on, when the picture came on, the pupil would naturally constrict if the kid didn't like himself. But we had turned the light up in the box previously. There's a little light bulb in here. We would turn the rheostat down so that right at that moment his picture came on, it would get darker inside the box, and that would make the eye open up. So there would be a conflict between the tendency of the eye to constrict when it saw its own image and the tendency for it to open up because it got darker inside the box. You get the picture? This way we got some of the kids to actually open up their eyes when they saw their own image. And if their eye, sometimes their eyes just constricted even though the box got darker, which ordinarily would get bigger. The minute the picture came on and got and the pupil would happen to open up when the person saw his own image, we put a dime into the cup, therefore building a kind of set of hope emotions about the experience of looking at one's own self and opening up the eye. Well, I'm not going to go into the analysis of the data from this experiment, where it's kind of a hair-raising job. But I just wanted to show you that, as you know, we are interested in all of the biomedical underpinnings of everything we're talking about. And we have 20 years of research on the drawing boards of things to tease out to make us more knowledgeable about how human beings are growing and developing. One of the things I was interested in trying to find out in this experiment was whether or not participation in the experience of putting on a play would help one gain a different self-image, because when you participate in a play, you get assigned a role. And you have to practice that role. You have to memorize the lines, and you get to put on new clothes that support the role, and you're on the stage with the lights, and you got people applauding. And one of the reasons I was interested in doing this is I felt it absolutely essential to get these kids to shake loose from their grip on a negative self-image. And it was so difficult to do that, so he had to create another world for them to live in, to try on another self-image. And since they all more or less knew what a theater was, and they knew what plays are, I talked them into it. Now, none of these kids had ever been in a play, because, as you know, they're the sorts of kids who would never be chosen to be in a school play. They wouldn't even think of trying out. So the opportunity was just closed to most of them. They just wouldn't do it. And, to tell you the honest truth, when I wanted them all to be in a play, there was such complaining and bitching, you wouldn't believe it. Oh. And they just did it for me. I said, well, just do it for me. Come on now. So, and you see, I was sure that if I could get it going, it would take on, because in the dormitories at night, these kids wouldn't go to bed till 3 and 4 a.m. They'd play loud music, that the whole dorm upset. And, but I went up there night after night after night to be with them, because I had to establish a bond of affection, otherwise they wouldn't try these things out. See, if you just, because you're the director of the project and you tell these kids to do something, they're not going to do it. They could care less if you're the director of anything. But if they like you, they'll at least try it once. So I had to be with them just hour after hour after hour. And my being with them at night in the dormitory and watching them and being with them let me know that every one of them, almost to a man, was a natural ham. I mean, they're such cut-ups, and they knew how to have fun, and they were laughing and poking and playing tricks on one another, you know, the whole night, all with loud music. And so I just was sure that if I could somehow institutionalize it a little bit and get them on stage, that they just might take to the whole thing like a duck to water. And but I had a director of the theater who, you know, who tried with all his heart and mind to understand the thrust of the program. He came around and did very well, incidentally, but at the beginning, when he saw what he had to use for typecasting, you see, we put on Midsummer Night's Dream. And Shakespeare never was the same. It was the most interesting Shakespeare. I mean, better than you would find most places, because they really gave it a new flavor. And especially that little scene within the scene, that little play within the play in Midsummer Night's Dream, they just did it so killingly funny. We were all rolling in the aisles, and of course they sometimes lost their lines and ad-libbed, and the way they ad-libbed, you know, the street talk of an inner city black kid is so different from Shakespeare that when they ad-lib and they go to that talk, it's like, well, it was terribly funny and terribly interesting. Well, the other problem was, of course, we had black and white kids. This was one of Indiana State University's first experience at integration, more or less. And so we had all those tensions to cope with. But one of the plays they did was Virtue is Her Own Reward. And it's a play of a family, big family, the older daughter of which is rather attractive. And the whole family is plotting and trying to find a way to get this older daughter married to a wealthy person who's arrived in town. The idea being that if they could get that marriage going, then they would just soak it, you know, drain him dry, and the whole family would be on the gravy train, see? So the whole family is plotting how to get this done. So the opening scene is a scene of a family sitting around a big table. The mother at one end, the father at the other, and all the kids around. And they are passing the food and eating. At the same time, they are making and laying the plans for getting the older sister married off to accomplish this enormous task. Well, when the curtain goes up, because we have an interracial class, the whole project was interracial, I told the guy directing the theater when he was putting together the family, I said, you must cast irrespective of race. So this was the Indiana State University first introduction to an interracial family, because Mama was black and Papa was white and the kids were a mixture. So when the curtain went up, and of course the white parents were terribly uptight about all this, when the curtain went up and the audience saw this and realized it was a family, there was this sort of terribly tense moment. And you know how it is sometimes in a conversation when a lot of people are talking. And so when you're talking with somebody next to you, in order to be heard above all the din, you're kind of hollering at the person right next to you. And then for some reason, everybody stops talking and you're just hollering out in space. Well, it happened on this occasion. One of the girls in the program, a black girl who later took an Oscar in her high school, she, after this experience, decided she had good acting ability. She tried out for a part in her high school the following year and took the award. She turned out to be really a gifted little actress. Her name was Zelda Fly. And we all heard Zelda say, when the curtain went up and everybody was talking and the audience realized that this was a family, all the stopping talking we heard her say, they ain't ready for it yet, but they're sure getting it. Well, there was that awful moment where we didn't know whether we were going to have a riot or what, but anyway, the play went off marvelously. Well, I wanted to see at the end of our summer, after everybody had to be in a play, whether or not that experience of letting their own self go and trying on a new self actually made them let go of who they were so that they could become something else. And generally speaking, we found that this was a useful experience. And of course, therapists have known this. They use role-playing and all these kinds of things, which is another way of doing it. And we advertised it. We had on TV, and so we had a lot of people coming. And the night before the first performance, the director of the theater came to me and he said, "This is hopeless." He said, I've got people who won't show up to rehearsal. I've got them, they don't even know their lines yet. I said, well, we've advertised, the show will go on. Talk about this guy having ulcers and all of his fear emotions organizing. I was afraid he wasn't even going to show up himself. I said, I've been up at the dormitory. These kids are all hams. And I just feel so sure, I said in a very shaky voice, that they are going to come through. You have to be positive, even though you're not so sure yourself. Well, I tell you, when the curtain went up, and there they were, they ran with it. And the audience was just enthusiastic, beyond belief. Now, one of the plays we did was Riders to the Sea. And it's a play with a setting in Ireland. It's a serious play. And it's a story of a woman, an old woman, which was actually played by Zelda Fly, whose sons all got into tragic accidents. And in one part of the play, one of her sons is drowned, and they bring the body back from the sea, and they're all wet, and they lay the body out in the living room, and she's sitting there in the rocking chair. And they do some Irish keening. Now, I don't know whether you've ever heard of keening before, but in Ireland, in the old Irish parts, when somebody dies, there is a keening ceremony, K-E-E-N-I-N-G. And during this keening, all the people sit around the corpse and they moan. And it sounds like they go, and make these kinds of, all together, and it just works up, and then it comes down, and it goes up. Well, this seems so stupid to most of these black kids. And, well, to all of them. But the black kids particularly couldn't help getting the giggles when they were keening. And of course, it's a very serious occasion, it's the corpse. So this made the director, he kept saying, the thing you must not do is break the type into which you're cast. Otherwise it destroys the... So I said to him, don't be irritated. Show them how to take advantage of it. So he said to them, if you get the giggles during the keening, you must put your head down next to the corpse like this so nobody can see that you're laughing. And let your shoulders shake as if you are weeping your heart out. Well, the night came, and they started keening. And I knew which ones were going to get the giggles, because once you get to know the kids, you know which ones are going to do it. But I tell you, they did it so well. When they got the giggles, they put their heads down, and their shoulders started shaking, and you could tell it wasn't fake shaking. It's just that we're not accustomed to distinguishing between shoulder shaking, from 500 feet, whether it's laughing or crying. And it came off with most people with such authenticity that they just got goosebumps on their arms to see all these big black guys up there weeping their heart out over the dead brother that's been dragged out of the sea, when in fact they're just actually giggling, because to sit there and make those sounds and wheel back and forth like this was too much. Well, that was only one little tiny part of our first experimental attempt at ANISA, and this was attempting to apply ANISA principles at the high school level first. Now, at the same time, I had some Head Start things going, so we were trying them at both places, but these were the first experiments of trying ANISA principles, and we had such marvelous success that was the first confirmation of the practical application of the principles that then fired up the furnace, as it were, in myself and others to carry on and go after the money to start developing the whole thing all the way through. Now, I want to tell you one other story about that, which has to do with the individualization of instruction. How can you arrange an environment and guide a child's interaction with that environment if you don't have a purpose in mind? That's the objective, and that comes from the curriculum. But you have to ask yourself another question. How can I pursue this purpose, this objective, and arrange an environment appropriately and guide a child's interaction with it unless I know how this objective fits in with the developmental level of the child? Supposing your purpose is classification. Well, if you don't know how well a child can classify, or if he can classify, you don't know how to arrange an environment, what kind of puzzles, blocks, Cuisenaire rods, or whatever it is, and how to guide his interaction with it unless you know this developmental level. You must know this, or at least have some idea about it. Otherwise, you will not be individualizing instruction, in which case the experience will not be opportune for the child, in which case you will not be having equalized educational opportunity in your system. When those 80 upward bounders arrived at Indiana State, we had the problem of finding out exactly how we're going to begin with those kids. And we got this big grant from the federal government, so we claimed that we knew how to work with these kids. And so we had to find a way of beginning. And we knew that interest is a strong motivator. It's a stronger motivator than aptitude, according to the research, and we found this to be true. In other words, you can get people doing things that they're interested in even more quickly than you can get them doing things that they have aptitudes for. Now, of course, if they are interested in the same things that they have aptitude for, that's where you get the quickest, you get the highest levels of motivation. But sometimes people aren't interested primarily in the things they do best. They're interested in something else. And of course, part of our objective is to find people, to help educate people in such a way that what they do best they're interested in, because then they really take off and make a tremendous contribution. I have brought all 80 of them together in a big room and passed out a piece of paper and said, I want everybody to write down on this piece of paper the thing they are most passionately interested in, something you want to find out about while you're here at Indiana State. And you have to be honest, because if you don't tell me the truth, then you'll be doing something you're not really interested in. Well, they thought it was such a dumb idea, as they did almost about everything initially. And I said, no, you just have to do it for me. So that's okay. So they all wrote down something, and I collected the papers and looked at them. And I read out some things. And one kid said he was interested in the history of aviation. I took one look at him and I knew he wasn't any more interested in the history of aviation than a rubber duck. And that, in fact, most of them wrote down things that they knew was socially acceptable things. So I took this whole pack of paper and I said, you've all been lying to me. Most of you have been lying to me. You didn't tell me the truth here. And so we are now going to find the truth. I'll walk over, open up the curtain, and wheel out the lie detector. I'd gotten a lie detector machine. The polygraph, it's called. So when they saw this polygraph, it was quite a big machine. You know, it has a big roll of paper about this big that goes through, and it has all these needles that go like this, you see. And so I said, this is a machine that tells when you are lying. It's a lie detector test. Well, I can see some of these guys looking at this and thinking to themselves, say, maybe this is a good time to get acquainted with this piece of equipment under such benevolent circumstances in case I meet up with one later on that is not quite so benevolent. So when I asked for a volunteer, I had an overwhelming response. Everybody wanted to try it. Then after they saw it work, I thought I'd get only 2 or 3 people to do it, but we had to do everybody. They all were enthused about it. Well, you have to make the polygraph work. I don't know if you know how polygraph works, but if you lie and you have any conscience at all, the way you've been trained by your family, those fear emotions are aroused a little bit because there may be some painful consequences if you're found out. So if you tell the truth, then nobody's going to find you out because there's nothing to be found out about. Now, when these fear emotions are aroused, only a tiny bit, the rate of your breathing is increased slightly, the heart rate increases a little bit, and the electrical resistance of the skin goes down slightly because you sweat a little. And that makes the skin slightly more moist. So this machine had a dial that monitored heartbeat, respiration rate, and electrical skin resistance. So there are 3 dials. And this paper is coming through very slowly, and these 3 pens are there with ink on them, and they go like this. You see, they just are monitoring like this, you see. Now when you tell a lie, it goes like that. See? So it goes on like this, one of the lines like this, and you ask the person a question, and when he answers it, if he's lying, here's what the question was asked. In just a second or 2, the dials go up, you see. And usually, they all go up in the same spot, you see. Or shortly thereafter. If you only get one of them going up, then it's not as big as lie as it might have been. Or it may be just a chance variation in the needle, you see. So I remember one kid, very tall, lanky kid. I wish I could remember his name now. It's on the tip of my tongue. But he was always kind of a troublemaker, and you could never tell whether he was telling the truth or not, just an ordinary conversation, because lying was such a part of his whole way of talking with people. So I asked him a direct question, and he gave an answer, and one of the needles went clear off the paper. And he said, well, that was a whopper, wasn't it? And I said, yes. It was. Now, how about the truth? Well, they got so interested in the idea of truth having some kind of objective basis that a machine could even pick it up. Now, of course, they wanted to know exactly how this machine worked, which meant they had to learn some physiology. They had to learn some psychology. And, of course, we found not only did we use that machine as a way of introducing a lot of things, but when we interviewed everybody and they told the truth, we found out what they were really interested in. They were interested in sex, in finding the best and cheapest contraceptives. They wanted to know about the pill. They want to know about everything having to do with race, interracial marriage, and discrimination. They want to know everything about the drug scene, ways to get around the law. They want to know all those things. Now, those were the things obviously impinging on their lives. And the regular school system would never give them any information about any of those things. So when I got that honest list, it was kind of a shocker. So I brought my staff together and I said, this is where we begin, staff. So my algebra teacher raised his hand. He said, there's absolutely nothing sexy about algebra. What am I going to do? I said, well, we're going to have to find out. There's got to be, if we believe this ontological principle that everything in the universe is connected to everything else, there's got to be some sex in algebra. We just have to find it. Well, these kids were very much interested in a lot of the racial myths. For instance, about interracial marriage. The idea that if a white marries a black, the literature says that this black is inferior stock and therefore it drags down and makes a poor quality of the white stock. They want to know what's the proof of that. The proof of that is, the disproof of that is in genetics. I don't have time to go into that now, but genes are randomly distributed at the time sperms and eggs are formed. And you can actually calculate the probability of certain genes being paired with other genes through an algebraic formula called binomial expansion. Sex is involved in algebra. We found it. It was marvelous. So, we started off our algebra talking about numbers of sperms and eggs and numbers of genes and what happens. So we taught those kids in the course of that summer how to refute any argument on a genetic base about racial inferiority. No, we had no problem at all. And then they got so interested in this, the Supreme Court had just struck down state laws which prohibited interracial marriages, just that year that we were in business. So they decided to do in the sociology course, they would do an experiment in the city of Terre Haute to find out whether or not, to find out what the citizens of Terre Haute thought about interracial marriage. And their idea was to have a mock interracial marriage in the main hotel downtown. And then, when that attracted attention, to go around and interview everybody. So I thought, wow, this is something. So anyway, we got permission from the hotel manager. He was so sorry later, but anyway. He later tried to deny it, but we had too many witnesses. So anyway, we got a platinum blonde girl and a handsome 6'2" black student. And then we organized relatives on both sides, because we had both whites and blacks, so we just organized ourselves as relatives, and the staff members were parents and aunts and uncles, and the rest were cousins, you see, on both sides. So anyway, all we did was, we went in the back door of the hotel, and came out the front door, and had a lot of people taking pictures and everything, you see. And then it was right at the rush hour, so there were long lines of people waiting to catch buses, and then everybody went around with tape recorders and interviewed people, saying, this is Terre Haute's first interracial marriage, what do you think of it? Well, we knew what they thought of it, but anyway, it was a sociological study to confirm what we knew they knew, or to confirm our knowing what their opinions were. Well, and then the two newlyweds got into a car, and we drove up and down the main street of Terre Haute, beeping the horn with crepe paper streamers, old signs said just married. Everybody came out and looked. No, I mean the whole town knew that there'd been interracial marriage. And then we took the whole crowd off to a cafe to be served. And here's where the white students for the first time got a sense of what discrimination is. Because the minute they came in the wedding outfit in this fancy restaurant, they wouldn't serve us. The white students couldn't believe it, that they wouldn't have a right to be served. So the manager came out and he was, dumbfounded and nervous. Nobody would serve us. So I got up and made a little speech about where America is and what it means to be an American and what democracy is and what human rights are. And one little waitress, nervous as a cat, came from the wall. And the others just looked at her like this. She stepped forward and served us all. And I know she was so nervous she could hardly do it, but it was a tremendous step forward of courage. And later we had an enormous discussion on how courage is required when you are making a stand for justice, and that therefore it is an important element in moral competence. We worked that into the whole system. Well, by the time I got back to my office, to cut a long story short, I had a phone call from the president of the university. And he said, Dan, I know you don't know it, but some of your upward bounders have been causing a little stir in the town. I said, of course I know it. I was right there with him. You see, I'm sure he knew that I knew, but he was going to let me off the hook. But I didn't want to be off the hook, because people are playing those kinds of games all the time. Well, my point is simply this. Those students never dreamed education could be so great. It changed their whole view in the course of 8 weeks, because we found out where they were in their lives, and we built the experience from there. Every inch of the way, and they got their reading, and they got their literature, and they got their math, and they got their sociology, but they got it first where it counted most. And you see, in the subsequent years, all that interest in sex, in race, and everything dwindled, and many other things came in to take their interest. And so it became more balanced. For me, it was the living demonstration of the workability of our theories. Because the predictions people made about what was going to happen when we got all those delinquents on campus, that number one, we'd lose them, and number two, they'd mess up the campus, and number three, the whole thing would bomb out and it would be a waste of money. Well, I still get letters from those students. I had it 3 years. A lot of them went on and became things they never would have become otherwise. You can believe that without a shadow of a doubt. And you know, we started just before the 4th of July. And the 4th of July back then was just like it is now. It was on a Friday. And we'd had them for almost 2 weeks. And we let them all go back to Indianapolis. And the prediction was that they would never come back. That they wouldn't show up when the bus was ready to pick them up at the rallying point at the courthouse. And we didn't want to let them go because we were afraid that was true. But on the other hand, we were so exhausted, we just had to have 3 days to sleep. Not one single student out of the 80 failed to show up and pick up time to come back to Indiana State on Monday. Not one. Why? Because for the first time in the lives of these students, they were placed on the cutting edge of their development, and they were beginning to have a sense that they had a destiny, number one, and number two, they might even get in charge of it. So those confirmations, which came fast and furious in the midst of many, many problems, nonetheless, I think were the chief evidences of the workability and the utter practicality of these theories if you really put them in practice. There is just practically no way to fail. Because if the theories are right, and I think they are, They reveal for us ultimate realities about the nature of man. And when you're working with that, and you're in touch with it, then you can be effective. It's as simple as that. And that's what our theory of pedagogy in part rests on. We have to go to have hot dogs now. This afternoon, I want to outline 5 or 6 other points and then involve you in some exercises which bring different perspectives on differentiation, integration, and generalization as a teacher has to view it in order to make her teaching effective. Thank you very much. Mag, do you need an announcement to how to get where we're going to go? Does everybody know how to get out to read? And that kind of activity, you may just kind of finish when you're tired of it, and that may be the end of it, see? But it's good if you can get the child, when he decides to do something, to articulate what it is he's trying to accomplish in a way that it is relatively obvious what the evidence would be for having completed what he set out to do. That's why an objective, in education, like, well, we want to improve the child's self-image. Well, that's all right as an objective, but you better break it down a little bit, because it's not clear by just that statement what you would accept as evidence for an improved self-image. So that if the objective does not suggest the nature of the evidence that would be acceptable as proof that something has been accomplished, then the objective isn't stated very well. Now, you'll notice all of our objectives here are stated in terms of what the child will accomplish. If you look at many traditional educational systems and their objectives, you see the objectives phrased in terms of what the teachers will do. When I examined the Title I programs and looked at their objectives, this is one of the great weaknesses. Objective number 1 would be, for instance, to provide a remedial reading program. So at the end of the year, they ask themselves, did we or did we not provide a remedial reading program? They said, oh, yes, we did. Well, we got that objective. But the fact that none of their children were reading seemed quite irrelevant. So that objective is inappropriate. It had to be rephrased. You want to say, our objective is to raise by 75% in 85% of the children the capacity to read as measured by some reading test. Now, you know what you're working toward. And every day that you make an assessment, you can tell how well you are accomplishing that. But if your objective is just to provide the remedial reading program, of course, that's what you're doing. But the kids may not learn to read in it. And we just found this time and time and time again in educational systems, the way they phrase their objectives do not suggest what would be acceptable evidence for having accomplished the objective. And we make that mistake with children too. That's why when I say to my little Sarah, I said, aren't you clean out the porch today? She said, okay. I can tell by the way she says it. That's a lick and a promise sound in her voice. I said, do you know what a clean porch is? This is establishing explicit criteria. It has to be swept, it has to be mopped, there can't be anything on the floor, and all the garbage on it has to be thrown out, and everything else lying around has to be put away in some place. She says, oh, Dad, because you know when it gets specific, then you know, too much knowledge is a dangerous thing. Because now you know what you got to do. But when you come back and assess it, you both know what it was you were working for. If you don't do that and you come back and look at it, you'll be unhappy with it, and then the child will have to do it over, and now they'll be upset and mad. It's better to get work through that right at the beginning and get it clear what's trying to be accomplished. Now, I'd like to introduce another pedagogical axiom right at this point, which has to do with timing and the setting of objectives. Generally speaking, it's not a good idea to set the objectives, to set time objectives. Let me give you an example. If you say to a child who is studying piano, to take a case in point, that their objective is to practice a half hour every day, our theory would predict that's not a very good way of going about it. Because actually, you're not just interested in the child being at the piano for a half hour. Is that really your objective? Well, that could be the objective for a teddy bear, or for the neighbor's gorilla, or whatever. No, what you want the child to do is to actually learn a piece, or to work out the difficulties of a certain passage, or whatever. So, we made this mistake with my own children, because, you know, just because you put together a theory doesn't mean you necessarily apply it all the time. Because we haven't been trained to apply our own theories very well sometimes. But I finally came on to that. Now, here's what happens if you set the objective largely in terms of time. The child will watch the clock the whole time. And they'll fiddle around, and they have to go to the bathroom, and then they have to get a drink of water, and then they have to wash their hands, and then they have to run out in the kitchen, look at the kitchen clock. And the time just seems to drag, and half the time's taken up asking what time it is, and how much time do I have left. Now, the minute you move the objective away from the time to the actual job, you say, this first 4-bar phrase in this Haydn sonata has got to be worked out without any hesitations, right notes, right timing at a certain speed, hands separately. That's the objective for today, and as soon as you've accomplished it, you can leave. You see an immediate difference in the way they tackle the job. They don't look at the clock anymore because that's irrelevant. And it may take 45 minutes, or it may take 25 minutes, or it could even take 15 minutes. But you get the job done. If you make the time the objective, then there will be fiddling around, and chances are the real objective won't even be touched. And there won't be that sense of accomplishment, because you don't actually get a sense of accomplishment by just waiting for the clock to go a half hour. There is very little sense of effectiveness that comes to a child waiting for the clock to move. But if they really work and accomplish something in 20 minutes or 15 minutes, there is a sense of effectiveness. And that enables them to come to enjoy what it is they're doing. Now, more people set children up for coming to dislike what they're doing by phrasing the objective in time terms only, rather than in what is to be accomplished. Now, that point is a very important one, and in some cases it's more important than others. But putting in time is never a decent objective. I just can't think of one single case. It's what you do during that time that you want to get at. So, and you'll find the quality of the work so much better if you don't put it in those phrases. Okay, I want to talk about prescription and diagnosis, speculation, experimentation, improvisation for just a little while. And then I want Mag to go down her list and call out the basic phrases which will cue my mind to certain other pedagogical axioms that are designed, when applied, to improve teaching right away. In many cases, often if you didn't have the rest of the Anissa theory. But if you have the rest of the Anissa theory, it's going to be better, obviously. We talked a little bit already about diagnosis. And we have a paper for you which will be distributed. I don't know if we'll have it ready for next week or not, Mag, maybe. We'll have a paper for you on some of these things which Mag is putting together now. But we have a few typists and a big typing load at the moment, and we want to get the psychomotor curriculum out. So we've got kind of an overload in the office at the moment. And in this paper, a lot of these things are explained, but I'm going to hit them briefly now. Diagnosis comes from that word gnosis again, which has to do with know. And agnosis or agnostic means to not know. And in fact, an agnosia is a form of impairment, memory impairment, where you just can't recall certain things. They're just, something went wrong in the psyche and you can't get at it anymore. So diagnosis means a method of coming to know something about something, and it's been used in medicine to identify symptoms as a means of identifying a disease. In other words, the symptoms are the appearance which let you know that there is a certain pathology behind those symptoms. In teaching, the function of diagnosis is to look at behavior as symptoms, to find out developmental level. These diagnostic efforts should proceed on the basis of any objective you have chosen. In other words, if his classification is objective, then the diagnostic approach should be to find out where the child is in his capacity to classify. If it's going to be seriation, that's it. If it's going to be whatever it is, then that's where you want to make the assessment. If it's content, you can find out whether the child has that information. Or if you know he has the information, you may want to find out, has he got it connected to other things it ought to be connected to? And then that's what you assess for. He may have a vague notion of something, and you may want to now make him very much more consciously aware of the content. And so you want to find out how vague it is, and if it's pretty vague, one way of getting him to make it more clear is to have him teach it to another child. Nothing helps to get things clearer than trying to communicate it to somebody else. If you think you know something, just try teaching it. We found this summer at Hamden, at our workshop, which is just finished at 12 today. I just talked with Don Streets. 11 of those teachers who've been with us, this going into their third year now, have to co-teach an undergraduate course at the University of Maine on ANISA for undergraduates with education majors. They're in charge of the whole course. The university's given credit for it, and all these teachers are functioning as adjunct professors. The state of Maine has claimed the McGraw School, where the ANISA model is being implemented there, as a certifying agent for the state. It's the only place outside of a university that you can get certified to teach in that ANISA school in Maine. Now, the minute those teachers knew they were going to have to teach ANISA next year, that purpose makes a difference in how you pay attention to what's going on. They just want me to slow up talking about half the rate so they can write everything down, see, because you know if you're going to have to say this over to somebody, then that's something else again. And they have come to rely more and more on their own experience in the classroom as a means of generating examples of what they're talking about, rather than using my examples, because my examples came from my experience and they're going to be quite so good in terms of explaining it to somebody else than an example you have yourself. And so they've been looking this last year at things that have been going on, so they're pretty well tooled up. And visitors from the State Department came down to watch them yesterday and today, and Don said it was really very impressive. And you could all do the same thing. I know that some of our teachers here have actually gone out, have been invited out to participate in symposia and conferences and so on. And when you have to put together a little hour-and-a-half talk on ANISA, and you give it, you know more about ANISA after you've given it. And ultimately, we have a system built in where people will give talks on ANISA to each other, because that's how you come to know what it is by talking about it, answering questions about it, and so on. That's a pedagogical axiom, that to consolidate learning, teach it. That's why we have in the ANISA system the provision for younger kids being taught by older kids. We have a problem in the Suffield system here now because the kindergarten in Spalding is located in a school where there is no first and second grade, isn't that right? First and second grade are somewhere else, so we cannot get the multi-aging, and we can't get the older ones who tend to be more advanced developmentally in there to teach the younger ones. But ordinarily, this would be built into to the whole system. Well, ultimately, we see that specialists in each of the process areas will be expert diagnosticians that the classroom master teacher can call on. Because you could just spend your whole day diagnosing. You wouldn't have any time to do any prescribing, let alone implementing the prescription. And you can't do it all the time, you have to select. You try to hit all the most important things. But it's a key to individualizing instruction. When you get good at it, it'll just happen without having a piece of pencil or paper. You'll just know the child so well, you know this is where he is on this dimension, you know where he is on this dimension, and so on. If you have too many kids, that overloads the memory. That's why we have ultimately a computerized diagnostic system built in, where at the end of the day, you will have an aide who will punch in where Johnny is on math. Write a clear specification of where he is. And on Monday when you come back, you push the button and it comes out and tells you where Johnny was on Friday. And you can go on right from there. That's built into the ANISA system. It's going to be a little while before we're there, but that's built in. Why not? This is exactly how medical people are doing diagnosis now. More and more in the big clinics, the people themselves are not doing the direct diagnosis. You come in, you have people who are sensitive to symptoms. They take them all down, they put them in the computer, it goes to a centralized, we have about 3 or 4 enormous computerized information banks for medicine. And on the printout comes the name of the disease that you got on the basis of these symptoms. And since many diseases share symptoms, they come out in many cases, this is our best guess number 1, this is our best guess number 2, and this is our best guess number 3. Now, of course, if the prescription for the best guess number 1 is to cut off the head, you don't have a chance for trying out prescription number 2 if number 1 bombs out. But ordinarily, on these prioritized diagnoses, and this is what we have to do in ANISA at this point, you have to try one and see if the diagnosis is right by making the prescription that goes with it. And if the prescription doesn't work, then that has usually something to say about the diagnosis, or that you didn't implement the prescription you came up with very well. The error may be in either place. And ultimately, we'll have much of that refined and worked out. I think, for instance, in 5 years, ANISA will be able to look at a child as he begins to learn how to read. And we will be able to tell exactly where the child's problem is if he's having one. Every inch of the way, and you simply will not load on this kid something he can't handle so that he comes to hate reading. And the same thing with math. These are 2 of the basic symbol systems, and therefore you're going to take great care not to get either of them messed up. Because if you mess them up, you're in great trouble. Yes?
Well, how would it be handled in, say, art?
Yes, I knew you were going to say that. There, it's a little bit different because the criteria for the objective you might have in mind are not clear. And they are more general and therefore more difficult to apply, and you have to proceed with care. But there are some criteria, and they always appear on a relative basis. That's why you need always a child to do 2 things, 2 paintings, and then compare. Because then the comparison begins to call forth the criteria. Is it balanced? Is there contrast? Is there rhythm? Essentially, questions of the formal elements. Is there symmetry? Is there asymmetry? Is there tension? Do the parts seem to be unified into a whole? Is it monotonous? You know, there's just a variety of these things, and we got them all written down, and we're going to put out a manual on it one day. But even so, something that's monotonous to one person may not quite be so monotonous to another, and so it's hard to be subjective in art, obviously, because there's more. It's a symbol system that's dealing with unknowns and indeterminacies. So you can't proceed with the same assurance there as you can in math, where 2 and 2 is 4, and that's that. But we'll have a chance to talk about this more during the coming year as we proceed. So on the heels of the diagnosis follows the prescription. Now, pre means before, and scribe means write. So you really ought to write it down. It is the verbal explanation of what environments should be arranged in what way and what the guiding of the interaction should be like in order to get the child to interact in such a way that the objective is achieved. The objective or the dimension of the objective where you had done the assessment or the diagnosis. After you've diagnosed and prescribed, then you want to implement the prescription. And implementation means arranging environments and guiding interaction. It's what you've written down up here. This is writing, this is thinking it out, this is planning, this is doing. Then you want assessment. Which is a form of diagnosis. It's kind of re-diagnosis. That's designed to tell you whether or not what you did got you where you thought you were going. If you didn't get where you were going, it may bear repeating, but not without reflection. If you didn't get where you thought you were going, then you may want to re-diagnose and examine the diagnosis to see if it was accurate. Or you may want to look at the assessment to see if it was accurate. Or you may want to see if you think that the diagnosis has been accurate, whether or not in fact that's what you did. See, the error could be that it could be the prescription could be right, but you may have goofed on the implementation of it. So you have to find out. In other words, you must analyze to see if you can find the error, if there was one. And if you can't find it, then repeat it. And the second time around, you may see something you didn't see the first time around. If the diagnosis is wrong, it means you're not on the cutting edge of the kid's developmental level. And that means the experience will not fit him. Now, there's a pedagogical axiom here that needs to be applied. If you diagnose the developmental level, say, and you get a profile that looks like that, then the experience you want for the child should fit this shape, say. I'm talking in very abstract terms, but if you put it right there, there will be no introduction of novelty in the experience. And that's another pedagogical axiom, the steady introduction of novelty. In this case, the introduction of novelty takes the form of determining optimal disparity. In other words, the experience you plan shouldn't absolutely meet where he's been. It should be just a little bit beyond it, because that creates tension, since there's a little unknown there, and that tension is called curiosity. And that tension is a great motivator for learning. So this is the axiom of optimum disparity. It's making the motivational match between experience, planned, and where the child is developmentally. Now, if you put it way over here, this is too big a gap. That sets the child up for failure. If you plan the experience and it's over here, it'll be old hat and it'll bore him. So boring a child is bad, setting him up for failure is bad. And that's why the idea of the optimum disparity seems to be the right doctrine here to be applied. Now, if you don't have enough information to make a decent diagnosis, you speculate. In other words, you theorize. And a good and decent teacher's got to be a good theorist, because our 20 years of research aren't done yet. We haven't got instruments on all these things. It'll take 50 years before we do. We've got some of them. It depends on how much money we get. I've got a group of top-flight theorists who are longing to throw their lives and careers into it. But it costs money to establish testing instruments and validate them and so on. Long time. So in the meantime, you speculate, you get your hunches together, and you experiment. And then you assess. Now, if the speculation was right on target, the speculative diagnosis, and the tentative prescription, so you speculate, you make a tentative prescription, and then you make the experiment, which is the implementation, and then you do the assessment. If that all turns out, and you do this several times in several situations, and it always comes out right, then you have accumulated a body of knowledge so that you can now apply that to making the diagnosis on subsequent occasions, and you have the knowledge base for making a very decent diagnosis. And one of the functions for bringing a staff together periodically is to share this information, so that what you've discovered through your good speculations and good experiments can now be part of the cumulative knowledge base of good teaching, and it can be passed on to somebody else. Both sides of this, the diagnostic, prescriptive, implementation, assessment, and the speculation, tentative prescription, experiment side, both involve elements of improvisation. What's improvisation mean to anybody? What do you do when you improvise?
Making up on the spot.